All right, we'll start the webinar and we'll give it a minute or two for folks to join us. Get organized over here. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Joe Keohane presenting his new book, The Power of Strangers, The Benefits of Connecting in a Suspicious World. He'll be talking with Rebecca Carroll, so you are in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Joe and Rebecca and the team at Random House for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple little housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. But there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions just from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program tonight. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, The Power of Strangers, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Joe's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat in a few minutes. Joe actually stopped by our store to sign copies of the book earlier this week, so you can get a signed book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request in order comments at checkout when ordering online, or just look for the signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Okay, some introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Rebecca Carroll. She's a writer, cultural critic, creative consultant, editor-at-large, and host of the podcast Come Through with Rebecca Carroll. Her writing has been published widely, and she's the author of the acclaimed memoir from earlier this year, Surviving the White Gaze, and the award-winning Sugar in the Raw, Voices of Young Black Girls in America. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Joe Keohane. Joe's a veteran journalist who's held positions at Medium, Esquire, Entrepreneur, and Hemispheres. His writing has appeared in New York Magazine, the Boston Globe, the New Yorker, Wired, Boston Magazine, the New Republic, and several textbooks. And I've been lucky enough to know Joe for a number of years as our paths have crossed here in Brooklyn, and I'm always delighted when I find out Joe is at a party, because I know he's always going to have interesting stories to tell. In his new book, The Power of Strangers, Joe sets out on a journey to discover what happens when we bridge the distance between us and people we don't know, and how it affects everything from our health and well-being to the rise and fall of nations. Kirkus Review praises this book for its lively storytelling and contagious jollity. That's a quote, but I was right about the good stories. So Joe's going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he's going to be talking with Rebecca and with all of you. So Joe, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's great to be here. I also like running into you at parties. Thank you for the kind introduction. Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Your book was brilliant and everybody should check it out as well. So The Power of Strangers is it's a book about talking to strangers, and it kind of works on three levels. One of the levels is kind of a look at the deep history of human beings' interactions with strangers. One part is a dig into the kind of psychology, the new kind of social science research into what keeps us from talking to strangers and what happens when we do talk to strangers. And then there's like a third part where I just try to get really good at this myself. And that involves taking classes. It involves putting myself out there in a way that was actually really uncomfortable at points. But just, you know, I really felt like I wanted to understand the mechanics of these interactions and I wanted to get very good at them. So the excerpt that I'm going to read is part of that aspect of the book where I took a 42-hour train trip from Chicago to Los Angeles. And it ended up being pretty eventful, and I actually made friends on it who I'm still in touch with, but I'd like to read that part because it was a hell of a lot of fun, and it was a very revealing look into what happens when people talk to each other. So this chapter is called Meet the Murderer and the Man from Another Dimension. Somewhere near the border of California and Arizona in the pre-dawn light, two men are talking about cabbage. One is tall, tan, strapping guy in a flannel shirt with the look of a rancher. So I'll call him the rancher. He's probably about mid-60s, The other is an older Chinese American man, and he's reading a book called The Plant Paradox. I'll call him the vegetarian. It's about 5:30 in the morning, and we're all awake because that's when, for reasons no one has been able to adequately explain, Amtrak has decided to serve breakfast on this train. So I'm numbly drinking coffee while staring out the window of the observatory car, watching the dim contours of the scenery scroll by as scrubby Arizona yields to California in the early morning light. And the rancher wanders over. He glances at the vegetarian's book and he takes a seat next to him. Are you into science? He asks the man. The vegetarian says, yes, he is. The rancher asks what the book is about, and the man explains it to him. It's about the dangers of lectins, he says, which are plant-based proteins found in many fruits and vegetables. This segues smoothly into a conversation about fasting and diet. The vegetarian has been a vegetarian for years, he says, since he retired, and he fasts regularly too. At this point, I horn in and ask if fasting makes him ornery. A large bearded man behind me hears the question and pipes up, "You bet I'd be ornery. I need my meat, man." The vegetarian nods and says, yes, it does make him a little tired when he's doing it, but he's never felt better on the whole. The rancher considers this and narrows his eyes and he asks, so what do you think about cabbage? Cabbage, the man asks. Yeah, cabbage. Cabbage is good. Really? It's May 2019. I'm on this train some 42 hours from Chicago to Los Angeles because in my quest to get good at talking to strangers, I wanted to find a situation in which it was the norm, but in a venue that's less structured than experiences I had had with a number of groups that I had sat in with who facilitate conversations with strangers. If you're looking for a context in which talking to strangers is pretty much obligatory, America is a pretty good bet. It's unusual among Western nations in its general chattiness, which has always been one of my favorite things about it, even in a deeply fraught historical moment like the present. Only in America would the cliche "never met a stranger" be considered so flattering and so desirable and so virtuous that it would appear in countless American obituaries every single day. I learned this from my Google alerts that delivered me about 50 obituaries every single day. So it was decided I would do this exercise in America. But where specifically in America should I go? That's where the train came in. I had read novelist and travel writer Paul Theroux's 1975 book, The Great Railway Bazaar, which is largely an account of talking to strangers while riding trains halfway across the world. After one fruitful exchange, Theroux writes, quote, "The conversation, like many others I'd had on trains, derived an easy candor from the shared journey, the comfort of the dining car, and the certain knowledge that neither of us would ever see each other again," unquote. I had also recently happened upon a magazine story about taking the train across the country in which the writer observed that train people are quote unquote individuals for whom small talk is as invigorating as a rail of cocaine. That was good enough for me. I booked a sleeper cabin on Amtrak's cross-country train, the Southwest Sheep, and flew to Chicago to catch it. Hours after I arrived in Chicago, I stepped onto a very large train at Union Station, found my cabin, and away we went. As the train eases into motion and the journey gets underway, the conductor, a natural performer of Colombian extraction, makes two announcements to the residents of our two-story sleeper car. Quote, "The coffee is hot, fresh, strong, and Colombian, and so am I," he says. And then, "There is no Wi-Fi on this train. They took it away 2 months ago, so you'll have to talk to each other. I hope you like each other." Classic Amtrak right there. He ticks off the rules and amenities of the sleeping car. Travelers are already circulating, sticking their heads into various cabins, introducing themselves, asking, "Are you our neighbor?" And my hopes for this trip were immediately realized. The beauty of traveling by long distance train is that strangers mingle without hesitation or self-consciousness. It is a completely fluid social environment. Like hunter-gatherer societies, which I study in the book, the model is fusion fission, which I will explain later. People mingle, meet, and introduce the people they meet to other people. And what's more, the awkwardness people tend to feel at the prospect of talking to strangers is dialed down. You are invited to talk by your presence on the train. That's the social norm. And you always have a good opener, which is, where are you headed? People on the train are almost always game to talk. You don't have to apologize or offer some kind of excuse for talking to someone. Passengers are constantly either having conversations or joining conversations already in progress. If you hear something interesting to you, you can just politely sidle up. This sort of wide open sociality, I'd wager, has to do with a few factors. First, a lot of these people are from the South and the Midwest, where people tend to talk to strangers. Second, we're all in the same metal container, which means you can quickly come to recognize one another on sight. And third, unless you're part of a foursome, you're going to be eating all your meals with strangers. And if you're me and you're alone, you're going to walk into the dining car and you're going to be waved over to a table and you're going to talk. My first dinner was with a retired couple, Penny and Bill from South Carolina. They were retiring, they were traveling to California to see Bill's brother. Bill's a retired Navy officer and his job has taken them all over the world. Penny tells me they have moved 29 times. Once they had made plans to travel to Nova Scotia for vacation. When Bill told her it was off, they were going to Paris instead. Penny was delighted until he told her that it was for good, and then she was shattered. She didn't want to move again. She didn't speak the language, which was hard for a born talker like Penny. Quote, my mother used to say, Penny, stop talking and eat, she tells me. My teachers used to say on the report cards, Penny is always talking, but it's just who I am. Having a dog helped in Paris, she said. It was an incidental similarity. It's another thing I talked about in the book. And it broke down barriers among her and strangers. She had started saying hello to a man she came across while walking her dog, Muffin. One day he said, bonjour, your dog, what is her name? She said the dog's name was Muffin, and he said, no, none. Her name is Croissant. And thereafter, every time they met, he'd say, bonjour, Penny, bonjour, Croissant. And after that, things got better for her. Since then, everywhere Penny goes, she asks dog owners what their dogs' names are, and it's a surefire way to meet people, she says. We talk, and she tells us all about their adventures, including the time they ended up helping a friend birth sheep on a farm in England. And as she's recounting the tale, she struggles to remember a word. She asks Bill, what is the male sheep called? A goat, he says. It's not a goat, she says. Hey, I don't know, he exclaims. I'm a Navy man. And as we talk, I can't believe my luck. All their moving around has made Penny very good at talking to strangers. After all, if she didn't talk to strangers, she said, she'd never be able to meet people and find a sense of community because she had moved around so much. One of her techniques, she tells me, is when people say, how are you? She doesn't say good. She says, I'm great and getting better every day. When she asks them how they are and they say good, she says, are you really? And then they just talk. People need to talk, she tells me. We talk for 2 hours about Amtrak's food, about life, politics, anything. The conversation just wends easily along, and I find them fascinating and lovely. Twice, Penny calls me a national treasure, which not to put too fine a point on it, but it's about goddamn time someone figured that out. Our fourth fellow diner, a fit, tan, middle-aged woman, doesn't have much to say except that immigrants were overrunning California as part of what she believed was a criminal conspiracy. She was born in England, she says, and she wears a t-shirt that reads love. That night, we're told that the train is being taken out of commission due to flooding in Kansas. At midnight, we're herded off of the train onto buses and driven 3 hours through the dead of night. Even then, people are still chatting, at least initially. The people behind me, after the usual getting to know you chit chat, realized that they were both hit literally by the same tornado. After a couple hours, though, people get tired and our bus falls silent. A tall, jangly man walks up to the front and he says something to the driver, and then he turns, walks back, and takes his seat. 20 minutes, he's up there again. This time the driver snaps, sir, take your seat. The other passengers exchange glances. 20 minutes after that, the bus pulls off the highway into a gas station parking lot that is full of police cars. The jangly man stands up, walks out, and surrenders himself to the cops with barely a word. He had asked the driver to speed up, we learn later, because, quote, there are some people I have to kill in California. The next day, the man who quickly became known as the murderer is the talk of the train. Over a Bloody Mary lunch with a retiree from Indiana and 2 younger Kentuckian women, we gaze out of the window and we talk about the fearsome emptiness of the American West rolling by the windows of the dining car. The man says this is nothing. He's recently started teaching an adult education class about the size of the universe, he says. He pulls out a quarter and he slaps it on the table and he says, if our solar system is this quarter, our galaxy is the size of the continental United States. We start talking about the sensation of awe after that. And when the train stops in the middle of the New Mexican desert, someone at another table goes, uh-oh, what now? I say, I'm not sure, but there are a couple buses parked outside, and one of them is driven by the murderer, says one of our companions. He's waving at us, and she starts waving back at him out the window. The rest of the trip rolls on like this, drifting in and out of conversations, some casual, some deeper and more personal, with a social worker, a dairy farmer, an art teacher, and others. Most people are middle-aged or older, but not all. Probably 3/4 are white, but everybody mingles for the 2 days we spend together, rambling across the western half of the country. The ample time and magnificent scenery make people comfortable and unself-conscious. After a day or so, I feel like I'm learning to have a conversation again, just sitting back and letting it go where it goes, a collaboration, not a competition. But what takes place on the train feels settling and restorative. It makes the complexity of others undeniable. Everybody is pretty good company. Everybody's story is a pretty good story. They're familiar enough to be relatable, but they're different enough to be interesting. And this brings us back to the cabbage. After the rancher and the vegetarian exhaust the topic of fasting, the rancher and I fall into a conversation. There's something about the man, something about the way he speaks that's intriguing to me, something eccentric that doesn't match his looks. I ask what he does, but he dodges the question. These days, he says, I think, maybe too much. I ask him, what do you think about? After telling me repeatedly that his opinion doesn't matter, he starts in on something. He says he had a thought early this morning, in fact, while staring out the window of his cabin. He says he's long believed in the existence of other dimensions and increasingly believes that they might be closer to us than we think. He says as we passed a freight train going in the opposite direction this morning, something took a hold of him. He says he noticed that in one sense, the freight train was blocking his view. but if he squinted, he could still see the moonlit desert through the gaps between the train cars. He says that he imagined this passing freight was as he said he imagined this passing freight as the other dimension, full of unknowable cargo, passing so fast we don't even see it. We just see our own world through the gaps between its cars. Quote, perhaps then, he says, perceiving another dimension is simply a question of speed. He wonders if it could be possible to slow down the mind enough to perceive this other dimension passing before our eyes. He takes comfort in knowing it's there, he says, but he's still happy to have a few feet between it and us. I wouldn't want to be walking around outside and end up in front of it, he says, and he chuckles. And then he goes quiet, and I get to thinking that I feel the same way about strangers, these vessels of unknowable cargo, containers of whole universes silently passing in front of us day after day, and us unaware. Some traditional island cultures believe this literally, that strangers are visitors from dimensions lying beyond the known horizon. And in a sense, they're right, they are. And we can go our whole lives without seeing them if we don't learn to look. The man and I gaze out the window of the observatory car as day breaks over the California desert, and he says that only on a train can you have such thoughts. And then he gets up and walks away before I can ask him his name.
Well, Joe, I have a lot of questions.
Excellent.
I love the fondness you have for this book and the people in it and the stories in it. And I think that that speaks so directly to the idea of strangers and what strangers mean. But I want to start by asking, well, first saying thank you for, I'm honored to help launch your book, Happy Pub Day. But also because for myself, if I were in the audience and for our audience, and because of course I was struck by something that you wrote in the final chapter about a fellow named Thomas Knox, who is Black. You wrote, his strangers don't always behave or act the way that my strangers do. So first is, how did you come to choose me to have this conversation? And then what did you mean when you said that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I chose you because I admire your work a great deal, and I really love the conversation we had when we did an interview for Yankee Magazine, but also because you yourself had been a stranger. I mean, the topic of surviving the white gaze is basically being the only Black child in an all-white town in New Hampshire, and I loved it, and I loved the insight you brought to it, and I loved how it made me question things from reading it. So basically, yeah, it's basically approaching strangerhood from different angles, right? There are different degrees of strangerhood.
Right.
You know, the idea that everyone's strangers are not your strangers is a profound and powerful idea, I think. And I think it's required. If you're going to be a productive member of a democratic society, I think you have to come to the understanding that your reality is not everyone's reality, that your experience is not necessarily generalizable to everyone's experience. And the great thing about making the effort to engage as many people as possible, both just in terms of sheer number, which I talk to a lot of people, but talk to a lot of different people too, people different from different groups, people of different ideologies, people of different nationalities, is that you learn that, right? You learn a really important lesson, which is that your reality is not everyone's reality, but you also learn that there is the possibility of connection across these boundaries. People have a lot of anxiety about crossing boundaries, about interacting with people from different groups. You have to be very conscious while you're doing it. I think you have to be mindful while you're doing it, but it is possible. And when it happens, I think it's relieving and inspiring.
But I think the other thing, and this is just such a lovely and peculiar and timely book, right? Because of us coming out of this pandemic and what we just experienced the last 4 years in the White House. And but then I'm thinking also about the quote of Kwame Anthony Appiah, who I've known for a bajillion years, about this thread of humanity. And so I'm wondering if you can track the idea of humanity with strangers responding differently to different folks, right? Like there's a broad swath of folks in this country who don't recognize me as human, let alone a stranger, right? Mm-hmm. And so just kind of reconciling the idea of humanity with the idea of strangeness.
Yeah, I mean, there are levels of dehumanization that exist across all layers of, or all like gradations of strangeness, right? People call strangeness. There's work by a man named Nicholas Epley, who's at the University of Chicago, who created this, or came up with this idea of lesser minds. So what lesser minds is this idea that we tend to dehumanize people we don't know. We tend to dehumanize strangers. And the reason why is because we just can't see inside their heads, right? We don't experience their full humanity when we walk by them. So as a result, we believe that they have less mental capacity than we do. They have weaker willpower, all these things. Now, this is like a general effect, right? As far as he's been able to tell, this is universal. But there are different levels of dehumanization. So I most likely dehumanize someone who's just in my way when I'm trying to get to the subway, regardless of, you know, what group they come from. But you start adding in cultural factors that aggravate that sense of dehumanization, and it can intensify and intensify and intensify. And, you know, racism is a great example of like a dehumanization of a group of people, but it's a much more severe form of dehumanization than Epley would apply to normal strangers that you're just seeing walking down the street.
But say more about that. Like, I probably dehumanize someone who's in my way. Do you?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, I'm a pathologically impatient person. I'm a fast walker. So when I'm walking around Manhattan and it's crowded, and there's someone who's like standing in the stairwell on the subway, this is like the cardinal sin of life in New York City, getting in the way. I won't pause to consider the whole humanity of that person. That person will become kind of an obstacle to me. You know, if that person fell down the stairs, I think that person would become a human to me, and then I would help them when they fell down the stairs. But like that sort of like, you know, there's such a mass of people moving at such a high rate of speed in the city that you don't have the time to ponder the full humanity of every one of them. It's just a question of like capacity.
Not pondering the full humanity doesn't mean you're dehumanizing them. I mean, I think that what's interesting to me is like, and this is one of my pet peeves, and I think probably everybody who lives in New York City is like, you know, we walk on the right side, you know, and I'm a runner, and so it blows my mind when you can hear me coming and you're standing in the middle of the side. But what my mind goes to is, who is it that didn't tell you that there's a world around you? Right? Like, your humanity demands that you know that there's a world around you. What is the difference?
So basically, like the idea of sort of light dehumanization, right? So we're talking about racism, we're talking about issues of genocide, we're talking about serious conflicts between groups. That's a much more intense form of dehumanization. Lighter dehumanization, which is this kind of lesser minds idea, just means like it just wouldn't occur to you. Like, you don't have that. You're not thinking, you lack the capacity to think this through when you're standing in the doorway of the subway train. You know, it's a snap judgment. It's not like if you sat there and really thought about it, you would continue to have that idea, but it's just kind of a way of managing an overwhelming amount of stimulus that hits you when you're in the city, that you don't really pause to be like, this person is like a full person. For me, and again, like, I'm a very patient person, and maybe I'm a bad person, but I definitely will regard people as obstacles and that sort of thing, or just be annoyed at them, and not just be like, you know, you poor man, someone neglected to teach you that this is the way we operate in the subway. It's usually just like, get out of the way. And that
so
can be like a light form
Joe.
of dehumanization. Yeah.
I feel like that's just a really, to me, an overall, like, it's, if we're trying to live our lives and be compassionate, what, you know, it doesn't mean that we have to sort of check things off. Like, okay, if there's somebody in your way, it's like, okay, let me sit down, or let me think about the full humanity of this person. Whereas this person is in your way, but does that make them non-human?
No, it doesn't make them non-human, but I regard I don't fully consider their humanity, I guess. And it's not that you're like an animal. I don't think you're like
right.
an insensitive object. It's just that I don't think you must not have the sense to know how to operate in this environment. And those are like lighter forms of dehumanization. You know what I mean? The thing for me is that I was definitely, you know, being like a fast walker and an impatient person, I definitely never really stopped that much to like really think about the people around me. And again, I'm not like a sociopath or anything. It was just like, you know, you're just,
I'm so glad to hear it.
Right. You're just moving around, you're moving fast. But the cool thing about like a lot of that, because, you know, a big part of this book was me learning, like basically learning from scratch how to become a much more social person in a much more freestyle sort of way. So not at a party, not in an interview context, but just like chatting with people in my day-to-day life all the time. And a big part of that is just pausing to contemplate the humanity of the people around you. So to get out of that mode where you're just like shoving through a crowd of people and they're just like faces with nothing attached to them, to train yourself to basically do what you're talking about, which is just being like, pause for a second before you get pissed off at somebody and say like, maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe things haven't gone their way.
I mean, don't get me
maybe
wrong. Like, I am for sure not a saint. I walk faster than anybody in my family, in my group of friends. It's annoying to them. I get that, you know. I just wonder if we are not putting ourselves too high, or perhaps sort of making an expectation or a judgment, a self-judgment of ourselves, if we are just trying to navigate and aren't suddenly, you know, like pausing to be a saint of some sort, you know. Or but I do also want to ask you about this idea of being social and talking to folks and asking folks. I mean, there is a direct line from being social and talking to folks and considering folks to empathy and compassion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a key component of humanization. You know, there's a lot of work on something called contact theory, which is basically like how you can alleviate prejudice. And the best way to alleviate prejudice is through friendship, having actual friends, you know, across those borders, because those friends like take residence within you, and they make it much more difficult for you to be like, well, that group is like that, you know, because then you have to stop and be like, oh, my friend, the Southerner is like, he's a pretty good person. And it makes it harder for me to just be like, you know, wipe off the South. All those things are really important, and they kind of keep you in check. And a lot of that comes from in-person contact, right? Like that's sort of like, it works best when it's over time. It works best when you're both equals in the relationship. You enjoy each other's company, you're talking to each other. But there is a decent amount of research now showing that even, you know, less like interactions of less length or less depth, those can start to alleviate prejudice too, for the same reason. You're having a positive interaction with someone from a different group. And if you were anxious about that going in, that's going to reassure you a little bit. So if I'm like, you know, who's the biggest stranger to me? I live in New York City. The biggest stranger to me is like a rural Republican. And so I would be more anxious about talking to a rural Republican than I would talking to someone from Mars, right? Like this is the big stranger for me. But when I have a positive interaction with some, I'll be like, okay, now this doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. It might not mean that we agree on anything, but it means that I can face the complexity of this person. And then that opens up the possibility, or it makes it much more difficult for me to like generalize about that group as a bunch of like witless cogs in a larger machine. You know what I mean?
All right.
But that contact's really important. Yep.
Right. Which is that when do strangers, or where does your sort of sense of morality, your set of values, when does that weight, you know, start to factor into the engagement with strangers, right? So you just gave a very good example, and I would agree. I'm less likely to engage with a stranger who's wearing a MAGA hat than I am with a stranger who has multiple piercings, right? However, at what point does the conversation give you the information you need as to whether or not you want to be friends or continue having that conversation?
Yeah. There's no hard and fast rule on it. It's just going to depend on how it goes, what your chemistry is, if that person is receptive and respectful, if you're interested in them, if they're, you know, that sort of thing. I don't think you can say that there's any one way to do it, but you kind of know when you know. I mean, there was like, I'll give you an example of like complexity, right? Because a lot of our problems now, problems of racism, problems of transphobia, problems of radical partisanship, they all have this dehumanization component to it. And a lot of them carry this idea that the people that are on the other side are simple, right? That they're not super complex, that you know what their motivations are, that you know what they want, and you don't give them a lot of credit for like, you know, subtlety and like an individuality. You know, you think of them as like faceless parts of a block. The great thing about having decent conversations across those borders of distance or difference is that you lose the ability to nurture that hyper simplified vision of the other person. When I was at Medium, I edited this big package where we did like 50 Q&As with 17-year-old kids who are all over the country, different genders, different races. And what I wanted from it was, number one, to push back against the idea that becomes very convenient among middle-aged people, that like young people are weak or dumb or things like, you know, like it just becomes the sport of so many people as they get older, just being like, young people aren't like we were. So I wanted to show the complexity and the intelligence of young people, just as a reminder that like you were young once too, and a lot of them are actually quite impressive. So there was one kid who was from Wyoming, Republican family, and the Q&A started out, he was talking about like his relationship with his father, and they go hunting all the time, and like hunting is one of his passions. And so we're like, well, you know, what else do you do besides hunting? And he was like, well, I can only hunt until, you know, a certain point in the day. I can't stay out all day because I need to be back for dance. And so the interviewer was just like, you have to be back for what? And the kid was like, well, dance, I do ballet. And so that's the kind of stuff I live for, that stuff. So you have like, you know, my bias is like a Northeastern liberal, is that I know where that's going. Like I hear this kid talking, I was like, all right, I'm not gonna listen too much more. And I know this is a horrible habit, but we all kind of do it. And then all of a sudden you drop something like that in there, and you're like, oh, it's a hunter who does ballet. Like this is really interesting. Those things really strike me, and I definitely had those experiences a lot while I was doing the book.
So exactly, right? So let's, you know, bring it back to the beginning and the preface of the book, where you talk about this conversation you had on Nantucket with a woman, a cab driver, that sort of went in a way that you did not anticipate, or anybody would anticipate. And so similarly with this hunter who is a dancer, you get this information, you get this insight, and then what do you do with that? How do you fold it into your brain, into your language, into your life? How does it improve or steer how you continue to live?
It works on a couple levels. So on one level, it reminds me to be curious all the time, because you know there's definitely a tendency to not be curious, to not ask people about things, to not pay attention to them, to not give them credit for like all these depths that they all invariably end up happening. For me, a lot of it is that it's just reminding myself again and again that this person is going to be worth talking to. This person is probably going to say something really interesting here.
Let me just ask you to pause just for a second. I don't want to be nitpicky, but I do want to grow on these things, evolve on these things that you're saying, right? Sure. Which is, I mean, my North Star, my guiding force is curiosity. And I encourage that in my son, who's now a teenager. But what I want to know more specifically is the curiosity does what?
It allows you to gain greater insight into the person, for one thing. You know, maybe they have a great story, maybe they are good company, maybe they have interesting information, maybe they have an amazing life story that is going to stay with you a little bit in the way that cab driver's story stayed with me, and in a way that a lot of people who I spoke to for this, I'd made friends with a lot of them, and their stories really stayed with me. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
And no, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's basically that curiosity. Yeah. I mean, that curiosity is just like, I do tend to be a curious person, but I'm also a person who lives in like a big, busy city, at least before COVID, when it's obviously a little quieter now. But training myself to remain curious, like at all times, became really valuable to me, because I can be curious in an interview, I can be curious talking to someone at a party, but being curious about everybody and thinking about everybody and giving everyone the benefit of the doubt before every interaction, just being like, this will be worth it. This will be worth like just having a chat with this person. It will generally go pretty well. And oftentimes there's going to be something great that comes out of it. I find that my curiosity is almost always rewarded. And I think it helps you become a better person, a more moral person in a way, because it allows other people to demonstrate their complexity to you. And again, like I said earlier, like understanding the complexity of the people around you is non-negotiable in my book, you know, especially if you live in a diverse country, especially if you live in a diverse democratic country, for sure.
We touched a little bit on race and the ways in which strangers are different to various people. And I have to broach the idea, you know, I mean, as a woman, when I have to negotiate in my brain constantly when saying hello to a stranger is inviting something. What kinds of nuances and layers did you experience in your research when you were dealing with that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I made a point when I was doing the book to not do the thing where I just made it my experience and then said, this is the experience. I talked to a lot of different people. A lot of the researchers who do this work are women. A lot of the activists who do this work are women. and a lot of them are actually introverts as well. They self-identify as introverts. But I had that conversation with a lot of them, just being like, you proclaim the value of these interactions, or you study these interactions. You have these interactions, frequently in your day-to-day life. How do you do it in a way that makes you feel safe? And there's no one answer to that question. It's a really complicated thing. Like I said, everybody's experience is going to be a little bit different. The things that I heard again and again were, don't do it in a bar because your intentions are going to be misread most likely. Don't do it in a place where there aren't a lot of people around. Try to find a good public space. Like a library is a really good place to talk to people, as long as you're not like the quiet part. Parks where there are a lot of people around and there's seating and it's comfortable and people feel, they feel comfortable and they feel relatively safe. Those are good places to practice this stuff. Doing it in restaurants in like a service context. That's a really good way to do it. I spoke to a CEO named Britt Moran the other day, and she says that, she's very mindful of that too. So the way that she goes about these interactions, because she has them all the time, she seeks them out, is she always does it with her husband. So her husband's there. And so then it's two people and they're having the interaction. So they can benefit from it. They can learn about this person. They can have a great interaction, but she feels safe, and, having, him there makes everything feel a little bit better for him. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be much more complex, especially for women, especially for younger women. I mean, depending on, I would say like my experience is going to be very different from like a Black teenager. Like that's not going to line up, right? There are whole layers of interaction that I don't have to worry about, that they're going to have to worry about. So in no way do I mean to like generalize my specific experience when I advocate for these things. But I did find a lot of places where people can actually have these interactions. Did you ever read Elijah Anderson? Do you know Elijah Anderson?
I don't believe I do.
He's a sociologist. He's at Yale now. He used to be at Penn, I think. And he came up with this idea of the cosmopolitan canopy. And this is a pretty elegant idea that he had, which was he set out to find and study public places where people of different classes and races seemed comfortable interacting with each other. And he was at Penn at the time, so he did most of this work in Philly. He did it in like the Reading Terminal Market. He did it in Rittenhouse Square. So like good public spaces. And I would say something like Bryant Park here in New York is a good public space where people feel at ease and they do tend to talk to each other. And he set out to define that sort of place where people can actually have these interactions, where people's suspicions are allayed or set aside for a moment. And these kind of interactions can happen. And then made the point that when they do happen, it can actually be really enriching for everybody and it could be good for society.
I read something, it's written in the book, but it was also in a review when I was researching that socializing is surviving and surviving is socialization. Is that right? Did I get that right? Or that being social is in some way survivalism? Yeah.
We tend to have the idea that friction leads to conflict, social friction leads to conflict, threat leads to conflict, and it often does, but more often than that, it leads to socializing, it leads to sociality, when people are able to band together to confront a threat. And this, I found this in field studies of hunter-gatherer groups and kind of traditional societies all the way up to the formation of nations and things like that. We do have a pretty powerful capacity to expand the idea of who we are. And it can happen under conditions of threat. It can happen under conditions of friction. One really great thing that I loved in here was about the evolution of hospitality. So I won't get too deep into it because this is a long story, and I've gone on this train before, and it tends to go for like 15 minutes. But there's an idea put forward by an archaeologist named Martin Jones. He's an English archaeologist, and his theory is that hospitality occurred around the advent of agriculture. And the reason why it happened is because as human societies shifted from hunting to agriculture, they didn't need hunters as much anymore. And that meant that a lot of the hunters are like effectively unemployed. They didn't have anything to do. They were just sitting around. So judging from like ancient DNA, right, which Jones studied, all of a sudden humans start traveling thousands of miles almost overnight, around 10,000 years ago. All of a sudden the species fans out in a way that it never had before. And Jones's idea is that this is because of hospitality. These men started wandering away from their groups because they had nothing to do. They had no purpose. And so they would come upon something that was new, which was like a settlement, right? Because we didn't have settlements before, we were nomadic. So now put yourself in their shoes. You're at a settlement. There are 20 people in this settlement. You're farmers. a guy turns up, right? Guy comes over the horizon, a single person. Now, due to the way humans are wired, like we're wary of strangers for sure. So you're wary of them, but also they seem to understand that you didn't want to kill him necessarily because he might represent something, right? He might be an ally. He might know something. He might have like a tool. He might have a gift. They found a lot of decorative like obsidian blades along this trail that humans traveled. But you need to deal with the wariness, right? You need to reconcile the wariness we have of strangers with the opportunities that they present for growing social networks and like enriching our lives. And so Jones's idea is that this is where hospitality came from. It came from that friction, the friction between being afraid of someone who just turned up, but also creating this kind of ritualized structure that allowed us to have a conversation with them. And so that was, the person would come in, you'd give them food. We're kind of reciprocal creatures, right? So they would kind of want to behave because you gave them food. Presumably there wasn't a lot of like open murder because this thing seemed to go on for a long time and it really worked. But as as people traveled through these nodes that were basically agricultural settlements, they were able to travel from point to point, almost like these were like bus stations, right? Now, because there are these fixed points, they can go from one to another, to another, to another, to another, and still survive because they can get food in these places and they can build alliances as they go. And Jones's idea is that that is like the cornerstone of civilization as we know it, building those social networks, finding ways to reconcile the fear and the opportunity, and also beginning to really take advantage of like the potential of like a random person appearing, who you don't have any context for. So that sort of friction ends up like
right. It's so interesting. And I feel still, as I listen to you say that, like, yeah, that's community. That's like what Black folks have been doing forever, right? Like, so, I mean, we could talk about this and parse it out for much longer, but we've got a bunch of questions. And so I want to get to our audience questions. The first is from Gwyneth Stansfield. Out of everything you learned in your research, what are some of the things that stick with you today and you use in your own life? It's a great question, Gwyneth.
One thing I really liked came from a woman named Georgie Nightingale, who's like a communications guru in England. She runs an organization called Trigger Conversation. And she's brilliant. I took a class with her. I actually went to London to take a class in talking to strangers, Georgie. She pointed out a really interesting thing to me that I think about all the time. And it's the idea of scripts. So when we have interactions with someone at I go to the grocery store, right? And I bring up my groceries and the person says, how you doing? And I say, good, how are you? And they say, good. And that's the end of it, right? Like, that's not a conversation. We've exchanged nothing. We've learned nothing. It's just a way of being like, I'm going to acknowledge you with the least amount of effort I can possibly muster. So, and this is actually a really good idea for people looking to like practice this stuff. Georgie's idea was that you have to break the script. And the way you break that script is by answering honestly and with specificity. So a really great, really clever thing she came up with was when someone says, how you doing today? Georgie would be like, I'd say I'm probably a 7 out of 10. How are you doing? And what that does is that it causes the person to turn their head. Now they know that something else, something unusual is happening here. But it also kind of requires them to answer in kind, because the way humans interact, like we tend to model how the conversation is going to go with each other when these things happen. And so she'll say, how are you doing today? And the person will probably say, well, probably like an 8 out of 10. And then Georgie will say, what will it take you to get to a 10? And this is an interaction that takes no time at all. But they might say, I'm going to go see my grandmother tonight. She hasn't been feeling well. I'm hoping she feels better. That would get me to a 10. And then Georgie can kind of, have the conversation go from there. So pretty much at this point, anytime I have what would ordinarily be a scripted conversation, but not every time, but a lot of the times, I'll try to do that. I'll try to be specific, and I'll try to be specific in terms of like how I'm feeling, but also I'll try to be genuinely curious as to how they're feeling. This was really cool during the coronavirus in New York, which you were here for, I was here for. That was a terrifying moment. And a lot of people on the front lines were terrified as well, the people who had to work in grocery stores. And a thing that I really loved about, because I never, I rarely do delivery stuff. I try to do everything in my neighborhood, is that people would ask how you're doing and they would actually mean it. Like there would be a real genuine concern that I thought was incredibly inspiring. Where people would be like, how you holding up? And people would really answer the question. And, these interactions wouldn't go on for half an hour or something because people need to do their jobs. But it was really, really heartening and kind of this sort of, it was just reassuring, that someone
it also gave birth, it also spawned like a whole new language, really, which was like, how are you doing? I don't know. how to answer that question anymore. And there would be this kind of engagement where it's like, let's think about how to either ask the question differently or answer the question differently. But it makes me think, I am that person who, I will say to folks, how you doing? How you feel? You good? What's happening? You all right? Like always, like every single day. And I'm willing and able to hear the specificity. And so I was just wondering, it's like for those of us who already do that, like what are we to take from this book?
I would say validation, that there's a large body of scientific research that supports your approach. No, that's great to hear. I love that. And people are certainly like that. People certainly are that way naturally. In fear of maligning the youth, which I always try not to do. I wonder if those sorts of interactions are in decline among younger people. Because you're not attuned to the people around you in the same way that you're attuned to the people around you. You know what I mean? Because you're present without being present. What do they call it? Like absent presence, I think is like the psychological term. You're there, but you're not there. And you're so accustomed to your attention being elsewhere that you don't even necessarily recognize the person standing in front of you. That you would be also that you might be uncomfortable, that your social skills might have eroded to such an extent that you're uncomfortable making eye contact. This is something that I came upon a lot talking to psychologists who've taught, where they would say, like, it's remarkable to me how difficult it is for kids to get to know each other.
Oh my God. Now I'm going to have an anxiety attack about my child.
I think your kid's going to be okay. And much of that comes from they've conducted most of their, like a great deal of interaction over digital platforms. And so the sort of improv that goes into interacting with someone in person, even something like what you're talking about, asking a genuine question to someone you bump into, that's daunting, right? Like all the levels that you have to operate on when you ask that question, which is like a very complicated interaction. They're not used to that. So they tend to shy away from it. They tend to disengage and they tend to go right for the phone. So a lot of the kind of activists I was talking to and psychologists, they're like, how do we train these kids to like be there again, to look at each other, to actually look at the people in front of them and wonder about them and wonder if they're okay. I mean, it's sort of correlation and causation in a way, but there's research that shows like empathy is plummeted amongst like people in their late teens and early 20s over the last 40 years. Like it's kind of dropping. And the idea, and I don't know how solid this is, the idea is that it's a result of not having enough interaction with people, personal interaction with people. Because you're empathetic. When you talk to somebody, you become, unless you're like yelling at each other, it gives you a chance for empathy. It gives you a chance for empathy.
If you take it in.
You have to be open to it. You have to be curious and you have to be sincere. But yeah, it'll make you a more empathetic person. So yeah, that was a big takeaway for me doing this is like, how bad is it that a generation is having a really difficult time with that? But also, I don't think that's exclusive to young people. I think that's kind of happening to a lot of people. You can see it, you can see people just not noticing each other. And that's bad for society, but it's also bad for them as individuals because they're losing the opportunity to have these sorts of enriching interactions.
Right. Okay. Caitlin Fontana. If in-person interaction, touch and contact is the answer, then do we have to destroy the internet in order to save ourselves? P.S. Hi, Joe. Love you.
Caitlin Fontana is an absolutely fall down, brilliant comic TV writer, by the way. I'll plug her work. We do not have to destroy the internet. We couldn't if we wanted to, but I do think that people need to be mindful of how they use it. If you're using it, if the bulk of your using it is like mindlessly ingesting things or combat, you're probably not using it in a super healthy way. If you're using it as a way into communities that you might not have contact with on your day-to-day basis, that can be really valuable, but you have to do it in the same way that you do in-person interaction, which is you have to be like open. You have to be curious. You have to give people the benefit of the doubt a little bit. I always like, Sarah Silverman did this a bunch of times and I really liked it. Where someone would go after her on Twitter and instead of just kind of flaming them back, she would just be like, so what's your, what's the deal? Like, what's going on, buddy? What happened? And she found that people would just be like, well, I'm sorry. I was kind of drinking. I had a really bad day, but people like their humanity would show when you get out of that kind of dynamic, right? You get out of that kind of like conflict dynamic. People would be like, well, thanks for asking me, so there are ways to do it.
the other thing about that, and I don't know if it speaks to Sarah's uh, efforts or goals, but I do think there's also this kind of in the internet circus and circuit, this constant kind of battle between being cool and aloof and also just being like, yeah, I had a really bad day. Right. and so I think that that's interesting too, in terms of talking to strangers, where it's like there is this idea of aloofness as a kind of cool, where, or as a veneer or as a facade, when really, and I think what your book really kind of outlines, is that we do actually want to engage with each other, right?
Yeah.
And we do actually want to have that make us more of who we are to each other.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think if people realize the importance of that, then that'll be fantastic. We do require connection. We require belonging. We are what we are because we learn to communicate and cooperate with strangers. So it shouldn't come as a huge surprise when it ends up feeling pretty good when it goes well, right? Because you're learning something, you have like an ally, sort of, you're gaining a foothold in the world, and you're expanding your social network. These are all things that led to the rise of human civilization in a way. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing you're working against on like Twitter is just the incentive structure of it. It incentivizes brutality in a lot of ways and dehumanization.
Michael Glennon here with a tough question. Do you think talking to strangers and listening to others and showing empathy in New York City can help reduce the rise in shootings and improve quality of life?
Yes, that's a killer. Shootings is incredibly complicated. That's not necessarily like an empathy failure. That is operates. That happens on a number of levels, all levels that occurs, and no one has figured out what leads to spikes in shootings. It's incredibly complicated. So I'm going to take a pass on that one, Michael. But it's a really good question. In terms of quality of life, yes, absolutely. I mean, we live in a city that has a zillion different types of people, where all languages are spoken. People come from all over the world. We should be engaging with those people. Like, that's the beauty of living in New York, is spending time with people who are going to be different from you and whose experiences are different than you are. That's the glory of this city in a lot of ways. So yeah, I definitely think I think it's really important for quality of life. And also, I think it's going to be really important for the recovery of the city from COVID-19. I think this city, like the social fabric of the city, held fast. There were a lot of problems, there were a lot of struggles, a lot of people had a really hard time, but I was really impressed by the way New Yorkers rose to the challenge, and the way they did it was by interacting with the strangers, helping their neighbors, doing what needed to be done in order to like hold things together as the city went through a frankly mass casualty event.
I think one of the things that impressed me about the book, and what I find interesting just in terms of conversation and ideas, is that you talk about it on a micro and macro level, right? Which is, like, this is the individual conversation I had, but then you sort of fan out and talk about the sort of broader behaviors of who we are. But while I respect taking a pass on the shooting question, and I'm not going to press you on that, I do think that using your book and reading your book to go into another conversation next is an important and valuable idea. So when folks read this book and have a question like that, where do we go next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. It's tough. Let me think. There's volunteering. It's basically like a lot of problems with fostering these conversations in America come down to segregation, right? So people are physically apart from each other. So it's going to be difficult for someone to like step outside and then be able to have a conversation that's going to give them a much more fleshed out idea of what the experience of this community is. But you can certainly volunteer. There are groups like living room conversations that are pretty interesting, where people of different backgrounds and different orientations get together and have kind of like philosophical discussions. I think that's pretty valuable in terms of gaining access to other people's experiences. There's a great group called Conversations New York, right here in New York, run by a great guy named Ron Gross, that I did some of those conversations, and that tends to be a pretty diverse group of New Yorkers there. And they'll have kind of political discussions. They'll have philosophical discussions, but like that's a start. But it's
Yeah.
definitely very complicated. There's a lot of like pretty cool public art projects aimed at community building that I write about in the book, where someone would put together like a giant community dinner where people they have representatives from all neighborhoods, and they're all sat with people from different neighborhoods, different races, different political orientations, different genders, and they just have dinner together. And that's a way to build some of those bonds. I always think like some sort of like, I don't know. My buddy had this idea of doing like a Peace Corps that put Northerners and Southerners together, right? Like this is what you did when you got out of college, you got out of high school. Like Northerners go down to the South and they work, they volunteer. Southerners come up to the North and they work and they volunteer. Kind of engineering those sorts of interactions is a very complicated thing to do. People will squeal, I'm sure, but yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I don't have a great answer for it, but yeah.
I mean,
it's
again,
tough,
on a micro level, right? Folks, as you talked about, playing in a black jazz band when you were younger, it's like that experience was really formative for you. And I'm quite sure, just in the few conversations I've had with you, helped to make you conversant in a kind of cultural, racial way. But then on a macro level, right, it's still, you still go into the world as a white guy with privileges and advantages, and nobody knows or is seeing, or it's tough to kind of gauge the way in which that formative, important experience for you, in terms of opening up your mind to Black culture, changes anything on a macro level.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it'll change the way I raise my kid. It changes the way I deal
Yes.
with people, and I deal with a lot of people. So it's
Right.
a little bit scaled, I mean, it certainly informed this book.
Yeah.
If this book inspires people to approach these things a little differently. I mean, let me turn that back on you. Like, what would you say is the way to go forward? Like, how do you broker? And you and I talked about this too when we
Yeah.
did the interview. What is the next step? We know that this is beneficial, but we also know it's very complicated, and it's going to be very complicated to like enact a program of people like spending time together. Like, how do you do it? How do you approach it?
To me, it's really a kind of total immersion. And that means that, every kind of conversation or creative piece that I do or project that I do, there are these kinds of elements and these kinds of themes. And it's sort of like, let's not drop the ball. None of this is a one-off. This has to connect to the next thing that we do the next day. This has to connect to the next person I talk to. That's essentially what Come Through is about, the podcast that I did about, we talk about these difficult conversations, but then we stop talking, right? So everything that I do, all of the work that I create is about creating that narrative and continuing the through line with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay,
great.
we have a few more minutes. I'm gonna close with your old pal Judah Berger. Hey Joe.
Judah, I can't believe it.
Judah here. We met in a park. People have been holed up for over a year due to the pandemic. Have you found that people are now overall more open or less open to speaking with strangers post-quarantine?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd like to ask Judah that question too. I'll email him after. So Judah I met because he was literally sitting at a table in the middle of Washington Square Park with a sign saying, "Where are you going?" And I went over to him and I was like, "What is this?" And he was like, sitting here asking people where they're going. And he had a great experience. He just felt that he wasn't meeting enough people, so he just set up a table and he just like invited people to come and sit down and chat with him. But he's a really good conversation. He's a really nice guy, smart. To that, I would say from my personal experience, there's an enormous pent up desire to socialize with strangers. I've gone out, I have a young kid, so I can't go out as much as I once did, but I've gone out on a few occasions over the last month or so since New York reopened, and it is an absolute blast. Again, the city has a lot of trouble. It has a lot of scars that it's going to have to heal from, and hopefully this is an opportunity to fix a lot of entrenched issues that we've been facing. But it was phenomenally fun. I mean, people were like, they were so happy to be around each other. And that might be kind of self-selecting because it's New York and people tend to be kind of social here. But it was really inspiring to me. It was really fun. And for me, I had such a hard time over the last year because I'm not a person that does well cooped up indoors. I'm not a person who does super well, like just not being able to move. Being back out there, people were like, they were curious. They were like, there was a sense of kind of triumph that we'd gone through this thing and we were all here together. In a sense of like people really bonded to the city. There's almost like a spirit of patriotism about the city, particularly among people who stayed here for the worst of it, I think. And I loved it. I had an absolute blast. I think the city is going to do quite well coming out of this.
Woo! And on that note, Joe, this was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks
and
so much,
congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. And yeah, again, everybody should get Rebecca's book, Surviving the White Gaze. It's really, really good. It's really challenging. It's really valuable. And thank you so much for taking the time. I always love talking to you.
A pleasure.
Thanks so much to both of you for letting us hang out for your conversation about conversations. It was excellent. I really appreciate both of your time. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I've dropped the link in the chat. You can get The Power of Strangers from Greenlight. You can even get a copy signed by Joe. And we will put this conversation up on YouTube within the next couple of days if you missed anything or if you want to share it with others. So thank you for spending time with us. Have a good night, everybody.